This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to part two of our conversation with Antonia Juhas, oil and energy journalist, her latest piece is headlined, Paramilitary Security Tracked and Targeted No DAPL Activists as Jihadists, Doc Show. It appears in the news outlets Grist and Reveal. Antonia Juhas is author of Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill, and The Tyranny of Oil, the world's most powerful industry, and what we must do to stop it. In part one of our discussion, Antonia, you laid out TigerSwan, and I'm wondering if you can briefly tell us what this company is and how they ended up being hired by Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the Dakota Access Pipeline, to surveil and monitor the indigenous resistance to the pipeline.
TigerSwan was founded around 2007. That date isn't entirely clear, by a just retired Delta Force 25-year Army veteran, James Reese. Reese has ties with Blackwater. For example, we know that in 2008, he worked for Blackwater. There's a State Department contract demonstrating that he had worked for Blackwater at that time. He has said that he advised Blackwater as well. And then Blackwater financed the first training facility that TigerSwan set up in North Carolina to train military, law enforcement, and some civilians in tactics that it had developed working as a private military government contractor, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, on a multitude of contracts for years with State Department, DOD, Homeland Security, in theater, providing security in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then Reese also started working in 2007 and turning TigerSwan's attention, more like in 2011, to domestic private security for corporations, and came on to be hired by Energy Transfer Partners to oversee all security on the Dakota Access Pipeline starting last year in September, and taking over after the use of dogs by private security against water protectors. And what we know is that TigerSwan set up this sophisticated counterintelligence program, including surveillance, infiltration, and manipulation, intentional manipulation of protesters, and that those operations encompassed all 4 states of the Dakota Access Pipeline, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Illinois, as well as Texas, where Energy Transfer Partners is based, but that these activities are ongoing. So also in Pennsylvania at a new pipeline camp, also in South Dakota at a new pipeline resistance camp, and also the reach of TigerSwan's activities revealed in the daily situation reports that were leaked, that Grist was leaked. Included their monitoring, for example, a protest in Ohio that had been posted by the Unitarian Universalist Church and that involved a bunch. I interviewed the woman who's named in the report, who also happens to be a reading tutor, and it was people walking around on the street, with signs in Akron, Ohio, and that ended up in TigerSwan's, surveillance web. Also in the documents, in addition to focusing what are really what would be very illegal, are likely illegal activities if they were conducted by law enforcement, so unconstitutional activities were they to be committed by law enforcement. We also see TigerSwan using, in its own words, surveillance and other operations on those loosely affiliated with the protests. So these are activists in Chicago protesting against, quote, the election of Donald Trump. It was a very, very broad net, ongoing net, that this paramilitary force was employed by Energy Transfer Partners to oversee in opposition, to stop opposition to an oil pipeline.
So what about the issue of legality? You say in your piece, U.S. laws regarding surveillance and other counterintelligence tactics don't appear to specifically govern TigerSwan. Why?
This raised a number of serious concerns with legal scholars I spoke with, as well as the ACLU, the National Lawyers Guild, who's representing water protectors in the 800 people who were arrested over the course of this resistance movement. So basically, we did have a period of time where our laws focused on private security forces working for corporations. This was the era of the Pinkertons, when we had corporations using thugs to beat up unionizing, basically. Well, the country's memory went pretty far afield after that, and now we basically don't have laws for private security. The way we think about private security companies in the United States is if you think about the mall cop, like the security guy at Walmart who doesn't have a gun and is just there. That's what our laws think about when we think about private security, which means we basically have very few. They vary dramatically by state. The enforcement is, can be almost nil, and there's no federal, almost no federal restrictions. So this is an area that you now have a private paramilitary security force used to operating in war zones. That's what those laws are. So that's who's operating here. And they're doing things that, again, if law enforcement did them, they would be unconstitutional, against the right to freedom of association, free speech, religious affiliation. TigerSwan very clearly focused on, Palestinians, people it described as Islamicists who were there. Black Lives Matter. I have a very telling story, Black people, and Black Lives Matter is specifically named. And of course, the Native American community. There's one very telling story, however, of a young woman who was doing what she described to me as self-defense classes for women and femme folk at the camps, very small groups of people. And by looking at the dates and the descriptions, she's sure about a story that then got reported by TigerSwan that reported, quote, unidentified member of the Black Panther Party is conducting hand-to-hand combat training in the camp. And she said to me, I'm sure that's me based on what else was going on at the camp, and that I might look, I do work with communities of color in Chicago, and she's from Chicago, where they also, TigerSwan spent a lot of time paying attention to activities in Chicago. And she said, I'm sure that's me. That's not what I was doing, but that's what TigerSwan reported. And again, that helped facilitate their desire. And there was a comment in a TigerSwan report that said, law enforcement isn't acting hard enough. The fines aren't high enough on arrestees, and they're not arresting enough people. And so what's possible is that these reports were an attempt to get law enforcement to act more aggressively, which of course it did in dramatic fashion with many charges of excessive force, with, again, a very militarized response, in the fields of North Dakota. And it's important to look at what, if any, role TigerSwan had in that.
Can you talk about the footage you got of TigerSwan training video showing soldiers how to do what's called clearing a room? The company's co-founder and chair, retired Lieutenant Colonel Jim Reese, a veteran of the Army's elite Delta Force, the Delta Force best known for tracking bin Laden.
There's a lot of footage of training that TigerSwan does at its facility, again, the facility that was financed by Blackwater in North Carolina. And this is a training facility for military, law enforcement, and also civilians. And that footage is, a theoretical home, probably in Iraq, and we see the soldiers, zooming in and immediately killing everybody, or what seems to be the likely outcome would be, you go in and everybody's dead. And this is the type of training that TigerSwan performs, and this is their mindset. And one of the things I quote in my story is actually a Harvard University study that pulled together a number of chiefs of police to look at scenarios involving private security. And one of the scenarios that they were given was, what if you've got a group of former Afghan military veterans, elite forces, who want to set up a hostage-saving force in your city and want you to contract them to do that. And the police chiefs resoundingly said that would be a really bad idea because they have an entirely different set of ideas about keeping the peace than does a domestic police force, and that the profit motivation would also be deeply problematic if you're looking at domestic operations. And I think that that footage, really helps crystallize the idea that these were just, the wrong guys for the job.
In an article for the Washington Examiner and posted on TigerSwan's own website, conservative columnist Tom Rogan advocated for the TigerSwan CEO Jim Reese to head the FBI. Rogan writes, quote, Reese would also innovate. Like any big organization, the FBI is ripe for reform. Establishing a successful global company after leaving the military, Reese would bring a blend of public and private sector thinking to bear. The Bureau might do well to transfer more lower-level counterterrorism duties away from agents and towards local police-dominated Joint Terrorism Task Force. Regardless, Reese despises static thinking. Your thoughts on this, Antonia?
Yeah, renowned civil rights attorney Jeffrey Haas, who is perhaps best known for leading the legal team that exposed the COINTELPRO program of the FBI over 13 years of litigation, is one of the lawyers who's representing the water protectors through the National Lawyers Guild. And I interviewed him at length about TigerSwan and the leaked documents. And one of the biggest concerns that he raised was that what it appeared most disturbingly was that what TigerSwan was doing was implementing a program of counterintelligence, surveillance, infiltration that reminded him quite extensively of the COINTELPRO program, which was, of course, found to be illegal, but that this is a private company doing what now the FBI and law enforcement cannot do. And the irony that now, James Reese apparently now wants to be the head of the FBI and bringing, these tactics back to the FBI, would be laughable if it wasn't actually unfolding right here.
So, Antonio, explain exactly what you understand TigerSwan did in North Dakota as it took on the anti-Dakota Access Pipeline water protectors.
We know that they conducted extensive observation and infiltration, and that activity took place potentially through online hacking. They discussed getting into private Facebook pages and to use the information gained there to essentially gain information that protesters would not like to have brought out, and that is potentially illegal under cyber hacking laws. We also know that they did on-the-ground collecting of information through source reporting and informants. And I shouldn't keep saying this in the past tense. This is ongoing activities that we know that they're still doing at ongoing camps. We know that they at least tried to use that information and those informants to develop rifts between water protectors, particularly looking at native versus non-native in their words, and violent versus non-violent. We know that they worked closely with law enforcement, and that's another deep potential problem here from a legal perspective. There are regular reports within TigerSwan's reporting of meeting with law enforcement officers across the state, but also federal agents as well. And that this level of sharing is deeply concerning because TigerSwan also stated in the documents released that it was trying to provide information that would be used towards prosecution. And so Jeffrey Haas, the lawyer Jeffrey Haas, had said that these are basically tactics that law enforcement would not have been able to gain access to this information. It would be unconstitutional, yet the private security company is gaining access to the information, providing it to law enforcement, and then that could potentially use towards prosecuting water protectors. Again, in these, some 800 cases that were brought against water protectors against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And what would be even more problematic, and we don't know the answer to this because there, as I said, there was this extensive relationship between TigerSwan, local, state, and even federal law enforcement, was if the information flow was going the other way. So if law enforcement was asking TigerSwan to do things that law enforcement can't do, that would certainly be illegal, and that would be particularly problematic. The documents provide a lot of information, but they mostly sort of open the door to more questions that need to be answered from a legal perspective. And one of the attorneys at the Electronic Frontier Foundation told us, she thinks that subpoenas should be issued looking at least at this issue of the potential hacking of private Facebook pages, and that, I think there is potentially a number of legal cases that could be brought, or at least more information that needs to be gained on exactly what Energy Transfer Partners was using TigerSwan for, and potentially, like I said, what law enforcement was using TigerSwan for, and what constitutional rights were being broken. As I said, the potential threats are freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. We had people being surveilled by TigerSwan and potentially infiltrated, in Chicago, far away from the pipeline. So the pipeline passes through Illinois. It doesn't pass through Chicago. But TigerSwan had these intense programs of observation, of trying to link. They talk about linking Black Lives Matter participants who had been at Standing Rock, or just people who are part of Black Lives Matter in Chicago, to 4 universities in the Chicago area, and making links between persons of interest in different institutions, and collating and gathering all this information. And all people were doing was exercising their First Amendment right to free speech and freedom of association. So these are all deeply troubling. I will say it was very important. I did a lot of interviews with people named in the documents, or people who were at Standing Rock or involved in these protests. And I would say to the one, they said, we knew that there was surveillance happening. We certainly knew that there was a possibility of infiltration, but this does not make us, this doesn't scare us. This may make us feel creeped out, and it certainly is problematic, but we're going to keep organizing, and we think it's really important as well that the public hears that as well, that we want people to be involved in these resistance movements, and we're not going to be cowed by TigerSwan's activities, because one of the pieces of information that came out in exposing COINTELPRO was that one of the key objectives of COINTELPRO was to create fear and distrust within government opposition movements, or within the Black Panther Party and other groups that would undermine those activities, and that just that fear that there's a FBI agent or a TigerSwan agent behind every corner could stop people from wanting to participate and to trust each other and work together, and that everyone I interviewed wanted me to know that wasn't going to be their response to this information coming out.
Antonia, tell us what Kelly Hayes was accused of doing, hand-to-hand combat training, and also Joy Braun.
So Kelly Hayes is a pretty amazing story. I had found in the documents that TigerSwan had reported in one of the documents that an unidentified member of the Black Panther Party from Chicago was conducting hand-to-hand combat operations in the Standing Rock camps, probably at Oseti-Sakowin, the largest camp. And I started interviewing people in Chicago, not even necessarily expecting that I was going to, find this person. I was doing an interview with Kelly Hayes, and I read her the date and I read her the description, and she said, that's got to be me. I'm sure that's me. But I was conducting self-defense classes for small groups of women and femme folk, and I'm sure that that's what they were talking about, she said, because there was nothing else even remotely similar taking place in the camp. And that, she said, disturbingly, that's not like those small groups of women and femme folk had been advertised on social media or even advertised in the camp. She said the only way that someone would know that those trainings were happening was if they were there on the ground. She said then what also makes it troubling is that the way, of course, it was reported, and that raises the implication that TigerSwan was intentionally trying to make activities in the camp seem more dangerous, and as it was doing throughout, focusing in on people of color, and people who followed religions that they seemed to not, find settling, to focus in on the potential threat of those people. Hayes certainly found it disturbing to have this information reported on her, but she said a very powerful quote in response, which was, I think if they're spending all this time, all this money, all this energy on trying to figure out who we are and what we're doing, that's a sign of our power and that they're afraid of us.
And Joy Braun?
So Joy Braun, a member of the Lakota tribe and a representative of Indigenous Environmental Network, was credited with the very first idea of setting up a resistance camp to Dakota Access Pipeline in Standing Rock and outside of the reservation. And she was one of the first in, one of the very last out. She's also set up, or is a participant in, a new resistance camp that's in South Dakota, and it is to keep going with the energy against the Dakota Access Pipeline because there's ongoing lawsuits there against it, and to begin resistance to the Keystone XL expansion put forward by Trump. And so I had a long conversation with her about TigerSwan and about the surveillance. And she said, first of all, we knew that we were being surveilled, of course, and potentially infiltrated, but we had no idea it was a paramilitary contractor like TigerSwan, and that was deeply troubling. What was even more troubling, though, is that the final report that we had access to from April 11th said that they are monitoring the South Dakota camp as well, and that they have an informant within that camp. And again, what she said was, we sat around a campfire in the very beginning of the camp, in the very early days back in April, a year ago of the first camp.
We just have 30 seconds.
Saying, what would happen if they started treating us like they treat people in Afghanistan or people in Iraq? And what she said was, we will survive. We've survived before, we'll survive again, we'll survive TigerSwan. And in one of her final statements to me, she said, TigerSwan said in its report that we are really organized. Well, they're right. We are really organized.
Antonia Juhas, oil and energy journalist. Her latest piece we'll link to at Grist and Reveal. Paramilitary security tracked and targeted no DAPL activists as jihadists, doc show. She is the author of Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill, and The Tyranny of Oil, the world's most powerful industry, and what we must do to stop it. To go to part one of our conversation with Antonia Juhas, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.